producing great Jews as Jews, but Jews who are also huge members of civic society itself. People like Chasta ibn Shaprut, who was effectively the treasurer of Spain, or Shmuel Hanagid, who was like the general of the armies of Granada. But the greatest product of the Golden Age of Spain didn't get to enjoy the Golden Age of Spain for very long, and I'll get onto that in a moment. Meanwhile, back in Western Europe, when we're dealing with Rashi, who's this? This is 1100, 1200, 1300, because I don't want to get... Who's this? No, that's not the Rambam. Not yet. Who's that? That is Urban II. Job description, Pope. And Urban is announcing the First Crusade, which begins an entire project of the Crusades that goes till about here. The Crusades, one of the most miserable and futile projects of the whole of human history, an attempt to wrest the Holy Land back from Muslims for Western Christianity. And when the First Crusaders set off under Godfrey of Bouillon, who was basically a neighbour of Rashi, and Godfrey of Bouillon, they set off and they go, oh, we don't have to go all the way to the Holy Land to kill non-Christians, we've got them right here. And the first thing they do is they massacre all of the Jewish communities along the Rhineland in an event which was known for generations as the Akedah. Just as we talk now about the Shoah, they talked for a long time about that event known as the Akedah, which was the destruction of German Jewry at the end of the 11th century. People sometimes think that the Shoah is an isolated event, and they don't realize that the project to exterminate the Jews of Germany happens here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here. And so people go, so why do Jews keep going back to Germany? And I say, look at your own generation. What is the fastest growing Jewish community in the world outside of Israel? Germany. But in fact, the lesson of this entire war is that Jews should not be living in Germany. And to say that to an audience in Melbourne, that sounds very mild. I actually go to Germany every year and I say that. And they love it. They just want their guilt. This period in Jewish history is unbelievable. The fact that we survived this period is unbelievable. The Crusades didn't just happen over the Holy Land, it was also happening in Spain itself, a first and second Reconquista, as Islam and Christianity are fighting over Spain. In the year 1148 is basically the end of the good times in Spain, because that is the year in which an intolerant, Talibanic zealot movement called the Almohads came through and put an end to the good times. And that is why I mentioned this year, because 1148 is the year of the bar mitzvah of the greatest product of the Golden Age of Spain, and that's what I meant. He didn't get to enjoy it for very long. I'm talking, of course, about the Rambam, Maimonides. Now, I'm going to spend a minute on Maimonides, because people say, oh, the Rambam. Oh, another name from Jewish history, very impressive. And they don't. You've got to put this in context. You need to understand who the Rambam was and who Maimonides was. Imagine a Jewish boy who goes on to become the greatest rabbi in the world, right? Now that's nice, and that's nachas for the family. And people, at the end of the day, someone's got to be the greatest rabbi in the world. But not just the greatest rabbi of his own generation, but the greatest rabbi, or greatest scholar of many generations on either side, who compiled a one-stop reference compendium of the whole of the old Torah traditions from the Talmud and the Rabbinic period up to his own age. The same person is also regarded as the greatest physician, the greatest doctor of his age. Saladin and Richard I are arguing over who's going to have the Rambam as their personal physician. That's starting to get some serious stuff. Greatest rabbi, greatest doctor, same person. The same person is also the greatest philosopher of his age, developing an entire synthesis between the philosophy in Aristotle and Torah. The Christian church is not in the habit of handing out medals to Jewish philosophers living in Muslim countries, but they have time for the Rambam. All in the one person. That is why his figure towers over this entire period. But Really, it is miraculous that we survived this at all. This entire period, as you know, life for Jewish communities extremely tenuous. Massacres, taxations, random expulsions, forced conversions, forced disputations, blood libels, book burnings, and more massacres. This period, however, is known in Jewish history as the period of the Rishonim. We call them the Rishonim, the first ones. In relation to this last 500-year period, we call the Acharonim, the latter ones. The Rishonim are the pillars of what we now know as Judaism. There is no center of the Jewish world. Center is created through text and ideas. It is a period of codes in many senses of that word. The great halachic works telling both individuals and communities about how to live as Jews in the world are created throughout this period. 1290 is an extremely important year. It is the end of the Crusades. It is the first major nationwide expulsion of an entire country, England, and it is also the year of the revelation of the Zohar, which became the crowning spiritual enlightenment of the whole of the Jewish mystical tradition that was to have such a profound impact for the next 700-800 years up until today. So as we're going through this tremendously difficult period, huge spiritual projects are being created. But I'm going to jump to here now. 1469. 1469 is the shidduch of the century between Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain. They decide that they're going to create this new idealized Christian Spain, and they bring in their friend Thomas de Torquemada to go to work on the Jews and the new Christians. And eventually Thomas turns to them and he says, look, so long as you've got Jews in Spain, you're going to have Jews in Spain. You know what you have to do. And eventually 1491, then 1492, we tried to put it off, but not just the same year, not just the same month, not just the same week, but the very same day that Columbus set sail for China. He set sail for China. He thought he was in India. In fact, he was in America. He was a Jewish navigator. Columbus writes in his diaries that he can't leave the port because of the tens of thousands of Jews that are having to leave as a result of the edict of Ferdinand and Isabella. 4 years later, of course, it was Portugal did the same thing. Anyone that thinks that there is a permanent Jewish community in the exile needs to look at the amazing 700-year community of Spain, which came crashing down like that. One small boy who got himself and with his family out of Spain and grew up as one door closes, another door opens. And not America, but the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire said, if Jews can make it here, they'll be okay. So many Jews managed to survive by getting to the Ottoman Empire. And this small boy and his family got to the Ottoman Empire. He grew up to be a great scholar. And he took all of the great codes of the Rishonim and welded them together in the last universally accepted synthesis of Jewish law, which of course we call the Shulchan Aruch. That of course, that person I'm talking about is Yosef Karo, and that's why Yosef Karo marks the end of the Rishonim and the beginning of the next phase. We have a major technological revolution in the world that happens here that we're still living in the shadow of. That of course is what? Printing. The rise of printing, which changes the whole nature of the dissemination of text. Yosef Karo sees the Shulchan Aruch printed in his own lifetime. So it's a major transition. Now, I'm going to do, whoa, it's already 9 o'clock, 1600, 1700, 1800, 1900. I'm going to have to do the last 500 years very quickly. In fact,
we'll give you extra time.
Give me 1 more minute because I'm making a decision now. I'm going to tell you a story. It's not a story, it's like a historical thing, but I think it's going to make sense for the last 500 years, and sometimes if I run out of time, it's the easiest way of doing it, and I think it's interesting. How to understand the last 500 years. You know, sometimes, not sometimes, always, when new anti-Semitic ideas come into the world, they soon become very trendy. People go, oh, that's a good anti-Semitic idea, I think we'll try that over here. And one idea that comes in around about here is an idea that let's take all the Jews of the place. Let's put them in one concentrated area. Let's build a big wall around it. Let's give them a curfew so that should we need the Jews for anything, we know where to find them. That idea is called the ghetto. And the most famous of the early ghettos is, of course, Venice. Who's been to the Venice ghetto? Oh, excellent. So those of you who know the Venice ghetto will know it's still a very mystical place. It's an amazing place, the Venice ghetto. Now, the Venice ghetto in 1520 was still fairly new. It was called the Ghetto Nuovo. And in around 1522, this very strange-looking man turns up at the Venice ghetto. He's about 4.5 feet tall. He's got brown, wrinkly skin. He's wearing bizarre Oriental clothing. He's carrying a big flag. And he turns up and he gets all the leaders of the Jewish community together and he says to them, "Get me an audience with the Pope." And they said, "Well, you could, but who are you?" And he said, "My name is David Haruveni, and I am a representative of..." the lost 10 tribes who've been living all this time on the other side of the mystical river Sambatyon that can only be crossed on Shabbat, because during the week huge boulders go up and down, and on Shabbat they come to rest and you can hop over. And I'm here to tell you that the time of redemption is at hand. Get me an audience with the Pope. They're blown away. And a few weeks later, he's on top of a white horse going into the Vatican. Now the Pope at the time is one of the Medici popes, what we call the Jew-friendly popes, Clement VII. And Clement likes David Haruveni and he gives him letters of introduction to go and visit Jewish communities all around the Mediterranean, but he is warned not to Judaize. And he turns up in Portugal at the height of the Inquisition, where he is greeted by King John of Portugal with diplomatic honours, because he's got letters from the Pope, and also he's not technically a Jew. He's a member of the greater house of Israel, but he's warned not to Judaize. Now, in the court of King John at the time is a young converso called Diego Perez. That means that his family, under the pressure of the Inquisition a couple of centuries earlier, had converted to Christianity. Diego was not a Marano. They weren't secretly keeping Judaism at home. He was a converso. He grew up as a good Christian boy, but he was aware of his background. He was aware of his roots. And he's very taken with the charismatic Haruveni, and he decides to explore his heritage and his roots. And one night he goes to Ruveni and he says to him, "Circumcise me." And Ruveni says, "No, thank you." 2 reasons. 1, no thank you. And secondly, do you realize how much trouble we will both be in if I do that? So Diego goes home, circumcises himself, and changes his name to Shlomo Molcho. And together, Molcho and Ruveni now have to get out of Portugal El Pronto, and they go on a huge 2-year mystical tour of communities, Jewish communities around the Mediterranean. Yosef Caro writes that he remembers seeing them in Adrianople in 1527. We have Ruveni's diaries, we even still have his flag, we have Molcho's writings. Molcho was undergoing transformed, ecstatic learning experience. He was prophesying, he was uttering mystical thoughts. People were starting to talk about them, they were arousing people towards redemption, and they were saying, you know, he's special, is the other one special, or they're both special. And eventually Molcho says to Ruveni, "I have to go," in around 1530, "I have to go where every Jewish boy who thinks he might be a bit special needs to go, and it's not law school. I have to go and see the Pope." And Ruveni says, "Well, I've done that, so you go." So Molcho goes and sees Clement, and Clement really likes Molcho. That's a whole story in itself. And Molcho says to him, "Look, Clement, we've come up with a plan. Let's get all the armies of the 10 lost tribes of Israel who are living on the other side of the mystical river Sambatyon, together with the Christian armies of Europe, and let's have one last great crusade. And let's get rid of the Muslims out of the Holy Land and establish an independent Jewish state in the land of Israel backed by Western Christianity. Because you know, Clement, that you have to have an independent Jewish state in the land of Israel backed by Western Christianity before the Messiah can come." And Clement says, "Oh, great idea. However, I'm only the Pope. You have to go back to Europe and I'll give you letters of support. You have to get the support of the Christian kings of Europe." So Molcho and Ruveni go back to Portugal and they speak to King John. And King John says to them, "Well, if Clement's in, I'm in, but I don't really call the shots around here anymore. You have to go and speak to Charles V, the doyen of the Habsburg Empire. Charles V, whose grandparents, Ferdinand and Isabella, have just kicked the Jews out of Spain. Charles V, whose uncle, Henry VIII, has just taken an entire country, England, out of the church. Charles V has just presided over the Diet at Worms that excommunicated Luther, and they have to go to him with this plan to have a whole new crusade. And Charles takes Molcho and he burns him. And he sends Rouvaini back to Spain in chains. The story has a tragic ending, but it's an amazing story because it's the first time since Beitar. I mean, look at, sorry, can I just move you here? Look at the scale of it. Hadrian, this is the end of Jewish sovereign autonomy in the land of Israel. From here until here. Look at the scale of it. Think how amazing it is that we live in a generation where we have Jewish sovereign autonomy in the land of Israel. For most of Jewish history, we don't have it. That consciousness comes back into the world at the beginning in the redemptive movements at the beginning of the 16th century, and people like Molcho and Rouvaini. It is those circumstances that let us understand what happened in the 17th century, where these redemptive yearnings, unfortunately, were crushed by massacres that happened right across Eastern Europe, and also, of course, the incredible events surrounding Shabbat Tzvi, which left devastation in their wake. In here we have this major thing that happened called the Enlightenment, which means that the 18th century is really, if you want to understand the Jewish world today, the Jewish world today has all its roots in the 18th century. All the great movements of the Jewish world today took their roots in the 18th century as a response to the Enlightenment. Whether we are talking about the Haskalah, the Reform movement, Hasidism, Orthodoxy, all of these things emerge in the 18th century. The big story of the 19th century is the story of emancipation. Most people don't realize that the fact that Jews have equal rights with other human beings in any given society is only 100 or 150 years old in most countries in the world. And of course, the big story of the 20th century is two events, of course, which is the Shoah and the Hakamat Medina, the rise of the State of Israel, which happened within 3 years of each other and which would be big if they appeared anywhere on this timeline. It is important always to remember, when we learn Jewish history, as I said at the beginning, it's a mitzvah of the Torah to learn Jewish history, because if we don't know where we're coming from, we do not understand that we are a people with a purpose in the world. The Jewish people do not survive generation to generation to hand on the recipe for gefilte fish. We have a purpose in the world. That purpose is to bring the oneness of the divine into the world and ultimately to bring the world to peace. As you can see why the Jewish people are at the cornerstone of all the great ideologies and forces that tug the world in different directions. The Jewish people remain central to that project of social justice and morality and freedom in the world. It is... We also have to realize that the future is as much a part of Jewish history as the past, and we have a part to play in this. One of the great spiritual leaders of the age, and I know that I'm speaking in the Chabad house, but even so, probably the greatest spiritual leader of the 18th century is the Gaon of Vilna. The Gaon of Vilna said the last 500 years of Jewish history is really divided into two. And the first period is from 1740 to 1990. And by when he said this in the 18th century, people thought he was Loco Naboko. But he said, by 1990, we must have established an independent Jewish state in the land of Israel. And he said that in the 18th century. So when he talks about what happens in the next 250-year period, we can't easily dismiss it, even though we don't necessarily see it at the moment. But he says the final 250-year phase, leading up to 2240, which is the year 6000, is the full reconciliation of Torah and science. That the Jewish people will be seen as an integral part of the natural way in which the world operates, in which historical laws unfold. The Jewish people are integral to the entire project of humanity and rising to a higher state of understanding of divine consciousness. That is the role that we as a people have. That is the purpose that we have in the world. But unless we understand how history has unfolded that for us, it's very difficult to see where we're going. You have been a great audience, and I thank you for listening. Please also bear in mind that I have only given headlines, Sheba headlines tonight. I've only given absolutely, like everywhere you touch, there's an ocean of detail, and it's almost embarrassing just how we've only jet skied across the surface of Jewish history. So I urge you to open up those doors and to look inside and see in every single facet just how much detail there is. But really, it's just a beginning to understanding Jewish history. It's a schematic. We have the biblical period going up to there, that includes the first temple, the second temple, the Talmudic, the Gaonic, the Rishonim, and the Acharonim. Each of those blocks is around 500 years. And so we can start to get our head around Jewish history, and I hope that that in some way informs people in terms of the scale of it.
Big thank you to David Solomon for tonight's presentation. I met David about 2 years ago around this time, and there was something about him, but more a book that he was carrying in his backpack that that really took me back, and I remember making this. I remember seeing that I'm going to have David present in Chabad Malvern. It took 2 years, but thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you to Ruby and Kamshki for spending the night last night putting up the paper. What I have in my hand here is a card of other lectures that David does. So if you'd like to come up and check one or two or all of them that you're interested, maybe we can do this again in the future.
If I could interrupt, we've only just arrived in Melbourne less than a week ago. And it could be that we're going to be spending some time in Melbourne. I haven't lived in Melbourne for decades, but well, originally I grew up in Perth, but we've spent most of the last 20 years overseas, living in a place called Israel and in England and other places. And I was just in Sydney now for 2 years because I worked on a Zohar translation project, but now we're in Melbourne. And the reason I mention that is because the boss is talking about setting up, this is ideally followed by a 6-week course where you look at each period in detail for about an hour and a half. And those of you who are interested in that should really contact, there's a website that has a lot of my talks where you can download them on Tanakh, on philosophy, on Kabbalah, on Jewish history. So if you're interested in that, register there, and if we get enough people, we'll run a course. And that will obviously be based on levels of interest.
Yeah, definitely.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming.